Echoes of the Veil, Episode 5, Debt of Silence. The first thing Echo felt was the weight of his own body refusing to move. Not fear, not yet, just heaviness. Each limb pinned by an ache that had forgotten where it started. The air in the hollow pressed against his chest, sick and cold, carrying the slow drip of water and the faint copper tang of dried blood. Stone pressed into his back in uneven teeth. For a heartbeat, he wondered if the monster had finally finished its work and he had woken inside its stomach. Breath came next, shallow, rasping, edged with a sting that ran from ribs to spine. He let it happen once, twice. The third time, something in his side caught and flared, and a groan slipped out before he could swallow it. Easy. The word was a low scrape in the dark, close enough that it could have been his own thought. Then a shape leaned over him, separating his face from the gray hint of light seeping through cracks in the masonry. Lyra's outline resolved slowly, hair matted and pulled back, cheeks streaked with dried blood and dust, eyes too sharp and too tired at the same time. "You're still breathing." Her voice was rough, almost toneless with exhaustion. "That's inconvenient for both of us." His lips twitched. It might have been a smile. It might have been pain pretending to be one. "How long?" The question broke halfway out of his throat. It tasted of rust. Lira shifted to sit back on her heels. The small movement drew his attention to the way she held herself. One arm stayed close to her side, bandages dark and stiff where claws had raked her shoulder. She had braced her back against a slab of fallen stone, turning it into a wall at her spine and a shield at his head. Between them and the hollow's low entrance, she had stacked broken boards and chunks of rubble in a pattern that looked random at a glance, and deliberate if you knew what to look for. Long enough for the veil to change its mind twice. Not long enough for the smell of your blood to fade. The hollow was barely a space. Two collapsed walls leaning into each other left a wedge of safety just wide enough for a body and a half. The ceiling hung low, cracked, veins of root and black mold crawling through the stone. Someone else's wreckage. Old beams, shattered tiles, a rusted iron hook had become Lyra's barricade. Every gap was stuffed with cloth or rubble to break lines of sight, to catch stray light, to slow anything that tried to push its way in. Echo tried to sit up. His body disagreed. Fire lanced across his side, where Lira had packed strips of cloth and smeared some bitter paste that still burned against torn flesh. His leg pulsed with its own separate rhythm, bandages thick around thigh and calf. He felt wrapped, splinted, tied back together by hands that had worked in a hurry and refused to accept how much there was to fix. Lira's palm landed lightly on his shoulder, the pressure small but absolute. "Don't," she said. "You held yourself together just enough for me to shove you into this crack. If you tear anything open now, I'll have to start over. I don't have enough shirt left for that." His gaze flicked down. The cloth binding his ribs and stomach was a patchwork of fabrics. His own torn tunic, strips of her sleeve, even a length of what might have once been someone else's banner or shroud. Every knot was tight and flat, designed for movement, not comfort. "You carried me." The whisper came out more like accusation than question. Her jaw tightened. For a moment, she looked away, toward the thin slit of the entrance where mist pressed like a living thing against her makeshift barricade. "You were leaking everywhere. I didn't want the beast to have an easy trail." He let that answer sit. The hollow smelled of her sweat, my blood, crushed herbs and damp stone. Outside, the world muttered in low voices, distant roars, something heavy shifting far above, the constant soft hiss of the veil's mist sliding around broken architecture. The monster that had hunted us was somewhere out there, or it had found something else to tear open. Either way, it was too close to forget and too far to feel through concrete fear.
Echo dragged his attention back to his hand. The spiral in his palm lay quiet and colorless against skin that had gone a shade too pale. Thin cracks of dried blood webbed out from its grooves. He lifted it a little, enough for light to find it. The world didn't tilt. No blue flare, no voice, just a dull, steady ache, as if the mark were a bruise pressed deep into his bones. It didn't help, he murmured. The thought had been echoing in him since before he fell. It finally found a way out. Lira watched his fingers tremble around the admission. The corner of her mouth twitched, not in amusement. It kept you alive through that ritual. It gave us a way out of the circle. It got the veil's attention. Her eyes narrowed. But out there, against teeth and claws, she shook her head once. That was me. And you. Mostly me. He should have bristled. Pride, shame, anger, those things usually had sharp edges. Right now, everything inside him felt blunt. The memory of the creature filled the spaces where reactions should go. The way its limbs had split stone, the stench of its breath, the sound of his own bones trying to decide whether to hold or snap. We almost died, he said. Lira snorted softly. It might have been a laugh stripped down to its skeleton. We almost die every day. This time, the veil pushed harder. That's all. Her eyes slipped shut for a moment, lashes dark smudges against skin gone a little too pale. He realized then just how long she must have been holding vigil. The stiffness in her shoulders wasn't just from wounds. It was from staying upright when her body wanted to fold. You should sleep, he said. You should be less trouble, she answered without opening her eyes. Then she did look at him, and there was something tired and stubborn there that cut through the harshness. I'll rest when I'm sure you're not going to stop breathing the second I look away. He let his head sink back against the stone. The rock was cold enough to seep through his hair, to remind him that the world outside his skin still existed. For a while, they stayed like that, two survivors wedged into a crack the veil had forgotten to close, listening to the ruins breathe. Lira, he said eventually. She hummed in acknowledgement. If you hadn't pulled me out. Her hand tightened slightly on his shoulder, not enough to hurt, enough to interrupt. Don't finish that, she said. The veil loves sentences like that. If I had died there, if I had chosen different, it eats them and spits them back as nightmares. He swallowed. The dryness in his throat scraped. It already does that, he whispered. I know. But you're here, which means we're still spending the day we survived. That's what matters. Silence settled again, but it felt different now. Not empty, heavy with things unsaid. The ache in Echo's limbs started to separate into pieces he could name. The stab at his side when he inhaled too deep, the throbbing line down his thigh where claws had opened flesh, the dull burn where Lira's paste clung to cuts, the stiffness in his fingers from clutching a knife too long. Each pain marked a place he had failed to dodge, failed to anticipate, failed to be enough. Lira, he said again, quieter. What? If it happens again, if something like that finds us, he turned his head just enough to see the silhouette of her knife resting across her knees, point angled toward the entrance by habit. I can't just be dragged.
Her brow creased. You weren't just anything, she said. You fought until your body stopped listening. That's more than most. Not enough, he insisted. The words came out thin but steady. You carried me. You bled more because of me. If it happens again and again, I'll get you killed. Her jaw worked. The muscles there jumped like they were remembering every time she had had to make that calculation. Weight versus distance. Blood lost versus ground gained. One life against another. You're already marked, she said finally, nodding at his palm. The veil has its own ideas about when you die. I don't care what it wants. His voice surprised him. There was a shard of steel in it he hadn't heard before. If I stay like this, I'm dead weight. I need to be less easy to tear apart. He flexed his fingers. The spiral pulsed once, faint as a heartbeat in the next room. I need to learn, for real, not just follow your voice in the middle of a fight. I want you to teach me how to stand, how to move, how not to get in your way. Lira stared at him. In the half-light, her eyes were wells she couldn't see the bottom of. You picked a bad time to grow a spine, she muttered. Is there a good time? That's the problem. She looked toward the entrance again, where the mist pressed and shifted, outlines of broken beams etched ghost-like against the gray. Training takes strength we don't have, time the veil doesn't like to spare. I push you too hard, you tear something open, we both die slower. I almost died anyway, doing it your way, running, reacting, hoping the mark would do something it didn't. That landed. He saw it in the small flinch at the corner of her mouth. She scrubbed a hand over her face, smearing a line of dirt across her cheek. When her fingers brushed past her neck and collarbone, she noticed fresh bruises blooming there in ugly colors, half hidden under bandages and fabric. She had taken hits for him he hadn't even seen. Echo, she said, and his name in her mouth carried more weight than before. You're barely sitting up. Your skin looks like it wants to leave your body. I tell you to lift your arm, and the rest of you might come apart with it. Then start with what I can do, not with what I can't. She looked at him for a long, measuring moment. She could almost hear the numbers clicking through her head. His injuries, her own, the distance to the nearest known shelter, none, the moods of the veil, the memory of the monster's roar. Stubborn, she said at last. That's new. It's old. I just didn't know where to aim it. A breath left her, half sigh, half laugh, worn down by fatigue. Fine, Lira said. You want to learn. You do exactly what I say. No arguments, no pretending you're better than you are. The first thing you learn is when to stop before your body stops for you. He nodded, the motion small and careful. And you remember, she added in fraction. From this close, he could see the tiny pale scars at the corner of her mouth, the faint tremor at the edge of her lashes. I'm teaching you to survive, not to be a hero. Heroes die loud, survivors die quiet, or not at all. I'm tired of almost dying either way. Good. Her hand left his shoulder. For a moment, the air felt colder where her touch had been. Then as soon as you can stand without falling on your face, we start. He drew another breath, testing his ribs. The pain bit down, but less sharply than before. The world swam at the edges of his vision and then steadied. I can try now. You can drink now, Lira corrected. She reached for a dented metal flask tucked between two stones and tipped it towards his lips with a care that didn't match the roughness of her words. The water tasted like rust and old stone and the herbs she had crushed into it to keep it from turning, but it was wet, and it slid down his throat and reminded his body of something other than pain. When he finished, a thin line of liquid had escaped down his chin. Lira caught it with the back of her fingers before it reached the bandages at his neck, wiping it away in a quick, efficient gesture. For half a heartbeat, her knuckles brushed the hollow of his throat. Heat climbed into her face so fast it startled her. She pulled her hand back a fraction quicker than necessary, turning it into the start of another movement so it wouldn't look like a retreat. Echo's eyes were still closed, muscles slackened by the effort of drinking without choking. He hadn't seen the flicker of color on her cheeks. Rest, she said, voice dropping. 2 more breaths without wincing. Then we see if your legs remember what they're for. He tilted his head in something like agreement. The stone beneath him seemed to ease just a little, as if the veil itself was listening and waiting to see what he would do with this borrowed hour. Outside, the mist gathered, thick and patient, against the cracks of their hiding place. He focused on the counting because it was something he could still choose. 1 breath. The air scraped less this time, though his ribs complained. 2. A thread of warmth crept back into his fingers. By the 3rd, he could almost imagine the hollowness in his limbs as distance instead of disappearance. I'm not going to grow new legs while I lie here, he muttered.
That would be one way to solve the problem, Lyra said. But I'd rather know what the old ones can still do. She shifted carefully, racing her good hand against the stone behind her to push herself upright. The motion drew a tight hiss from between her teeth. The bandages at her shoulder had darkened in one corner since he first noticed them. She had been moving, lifting, fighting the whole time he lay useless. Slowly, she added, turning back to him. If you black out, I'm leaving you on the floor until the veil decides which one of us it wants more. He believed her. He also knew she was lying. That helped. Echo planted his uninjured hand flat against the ground. The stone beneath his palm felt damp, the moisture seeping up into his skin. Small grains of grit pressed into his flesh. The spiral there throbbed once, as if resenting the weight. He bent his good leg, drawing his heel in until his boot found purchase. The wounded one lagged, muscles knotting in protest when he tried to move it. For a moment, his vision narrowed to a tunnel, fringed with gray. Sweat broke out across his forehead, cold and immediate. Breathe, Lyra said. He hadn't realized he'd stopped. He dragged air into his lungs, let it rattle out. His stomach clenched against the pull of his bandages. The hollow swayed and then steadied. On 3, she said. You're not jumping off a ledge, you're standing up. Your body knows how to do this. Your fear is the part that doesn't. He almost laughed. The sound caught on the way up and turned into a rough exhale. Ready? She asked. No, he said. Good enough. She rose first, using the stone wall like a second spine. When she was fully upright, she extended her hand toward him. Echo stared at it. The fingers were nicked and bruised, nails rimmed with dirt. The calluses along her palm and the side of her index finger told stories of years spent with steel and rope and rough ground. There was a smear of dried blood along the base of her thumb. His or hers, he couldn't tell. He reached up. Their hands met in the middle. Her grip closed around his with practiced care. Firm where he needed it, loose where pressure would have hurt. The spiral under his skin pulsed at the contact. A small jolt, like putting his fingers too close to a live wire. Lyra's brows pinched at the flicker of glow that threatened to rise in his palm, but it died before the light could build. She pulled, guiding more than dragging, letting him do as much of the work as his body would allow. His legs argued every inch. Fire ran down his side. His thigh screamed where claws had gone deep. The hollow spun once, twice, then snapped back into place as he managed to find his feet. He swayed. The world lurched to the left. Lyra stepped in without thinking, her free hand coming to rest against his upper arm, fingers spreading to steady, not to restrain. Her shoulder brushed his chest. For a breath, they were close enough that he could feel the heat of her skin through the torn layers of cloth. Color rose unbidden, up the side of her neck. She caught herself, stepping back just a fraction and letting her hand fall away in a motion that pretended to be nothing more than practical. You're upright. That's something. Echo blinked until the walls stopped breathing like lungs. His knees trembled. The hollow felt even smaller from this angle, the ceiling lower, the cracks more like teeth than fractures. I'm not feeling like I'm standing on the monster's back, he said. You're standing on broken stone. Lyra tilted her head, assessing him. The monster's back was smoother. He huffed out something like a laugh. It hurt, but not worse than everything else. Good. She nodded once, decision made. We're going to step out, just to that gap. She jerked her chin toward the narrow opening choked with boards and rocks. No veil, no beasts, no rituals, just you, your feet, and a little more space to fall in without cracking your skull. "That's very comforting," he said. "It wasn't meant to be." She moved past him, slipping through the small break in the barricade with the ease of someone who had wedged herself through too many tight places to count. For a heartbeat, he watched her go. The way she angled her body to avoid reopening her own shoulder wound, the silent check she did with her eyes before she ever committed her weight to the next stone. She was hurt, yes, but every movement still obeyed a logic honed by repetition. Where to put pressure, where to trust the ground, where to assume betrayal. Echo took a breath, tasted dust and old fear, and followed. The gap forced him to turn sideways, shoulder scraping the rough edge of stone. His bandages tugged. A hot line of pain drew itself along his ribs and then settled into a simmer. He gritted his teeth and pushed through. Outside the hollow, the world widened by a sliver. They were still buried deep in the bowels of some forgotten structure, or several structures that had collapsed into each other. The ceiling arched overhead and fractured ribs of stone and wood, leaving slits where mist leaked in like pale smoke. The floor dipped and rose in uneven planes, chunks of fallen masonry piled in slow-motion waves. Shadows lay thick in the corners, clinging to debris, reluctant to move, even when the veil's faint, sourless light shifted.
Lyra had chosen a small pocket just beyond the barricade. 3 waist-high blocks of shattered wall formed a rough triangle, their flat tops dusted with grit. Between them, a patch of floor lay relatively clear. "This is enough," she said. Echo glanced toward the darker corridors leading away from their little island. One to the left, sloping down into thicker mist. Another ahead, broken steps leading up to a choke point where roots hung like dead fingers. His mark gave a faint, sour pulse when his eyes lingered too long on the downward path. He filed the reaction away without comment. "You're not taking me far," he noted. "You couldn't make it far, and I don't want to explain to the next thing that finds us why my training dummy died in the middle of the hall." He grimaced. "Reassuring?" "Stop fishing for comfort. It wastes time." She flicked her fingers toward the center of the triangle. "Stand there." He shuffled into place, boots crunching on fine debris. The ground underfoot felt mostly solid, though there was a subtle give in one crack that made him adjust his weight instinctively. The awareness itself was new. Before, he would have noticed only when he slipped. Lyra stepped in front of him, just outside arm's reach. She rolled her injured shoulder experimentally, winced, and settled for keeping that side turned slightly away. "First lesson, your body is the armor you actually have, not the rags you wear, not the rock you hide behind. How you stand decides how you fall." She crouched, then rose onto her balls of her feet, letting him see the way her weight shifted. "Look at my feet, not my knife, not my eyes. You can lie with those. Your stance tells the truth." He obeyed. Her boots were planted wider than his, one slightly ahead of the other. Her knees were loose, not locked. Her center of gravity sat low, like a spring half compressed instead of a stick waiting to snap. When you stand like you did before, you make yourself tall and easy to push over. Good for statues, bad for staying alive. She stepped closer and tapped the side of his ankle with the toe of her boot. The contact was light, a suggestion rather than a blow. "Widen," she said. He moved his foot out, feeling the pull along his wounded thigh. It hurt. It also made it harder to imagine a single hit knocking him straight onto his back. "Now turn this one a little." Her hand hovered near his boot, not touching this time, letting him find the angle. If something hits you from the front, you have room to shift instead of just folding. He adjusted. The change felt awkward, like wearing someone else's clothes. "It feels wrong," he said. "Good," answered she. "Wrong is just not what you've been doing long enough to die from yet. We're trying something else."
Her mouth twitched. She couldn't tell if it was a joke. Maybe she couldn't either. She stepped in again, closer this time. Her hand reached for his shoulder, fingers spreading over the fabric at the top of his arm. The warmth of her skin sunk through the cloth before he even registered the motion. "Relax here," she said. "You were holding it like the rest of you was about to fall off." He hadn't realized his muscles were clenched that tight. At her touch, he forced himself to let the tension bleed out, inch by inch. His shoulder dropped a fraction. The shift traveled down his back and into his hips. "Better," she murmured. For a second, she was aware of how close they were. The hollow echo of their breathing filled the small space between them. She could see every cut on his face, every smear of grime, the thin line at the corner of his mouth where he had bitten down on pain. Heat climbed up from her chest toward her throat without her permission. She stepped back a pace, turning the movement into a pivot as if she were simply circling to see him from another angle. "Arms," she said, and if her voice came out a shade rougher, she smoothed it by force. "You are like to flail. That just gives whatever you're fighting more places to break." She lifted her own right arm, bending the elbow so her forearm came up to guard the space between chest and face. "Here," she said. "You're not waving the knife around. You're keeping it close. Short cuts, small movements. Big swings are for people who want to impress the veil before it eats them." He mirrored her as best he could. When his elbow drifted too far out, she reached to nudge it in, fingers wrapping gently for an instant before letting go. Each correction was precise, never longer than it had to be. She treated him like a collection of angles and levers that could be shifted into better lines, all while minutely avoiding pressing too hard on bruises she could see and some she could only guess at. "How do you know where I'm hurt?" he asked, after the third time she adjusted him without making something spasm. "You make a face," she said. "I don't." "You do." A faint ghost of a smile threatened the corner of her lips. "It's very dramatic. The veil would applaud if it had hands." He snorted, more from reflex than amusement. The motion tugged at his side. He hissed, then laughed at himself for hissing, which hurt more. "See?" she said softly. "That one." The humor bled out, but what replaced it wasn't cold. It was something steadier. She reached up again, fingers light on his forearm as she guided it a little higher. "If you get this wrong out there, something bites your throat, so get used to having it right in here, in a place where the worst that happens is you fall on your face and I laugh." "You wouldn't," he said. Not out loud. His heart did something strange then, a little stutter that had nothing to do with blood loss. He looked at her, really looked, past the bruises and bandages, and the flat way she pretended the world couldn't touch her. "You stayed," he said. "We've been through this. Hard to drag someone if you leave." "I mean, you could have..." He faltered, searching for the shape of the thought. "You could have cut the weight, found somewhere else, alone." Her eyes flicked away, just for a breath, to the far shadows where the broken corridor sloped down into thicker mist. Alone is easier until something big finds you. Then it's just lonely. She stepped in, closing the distance again, and set both hands lightly on his forearms. Again. Raise, guard, breathe. He did as she asked. The motions were clumsy, jerky at first. His muscles shook with the effort of holding positions that felt foreign. But each repetition smoothed one rough edge. Each breath he remembered to take on purpose made the world a fraction less likely to go black. The spiral in his palm stayed quiet, a weight more than a presence. Whatever it had done in the circle and the tunnels, whatever it might do in the future, it offered nothing now. Good, he thought, surprising himself. This is mine then. This is ours. Lyra's fingers brushed his wrist as she corrected a final angle. Her skin was warm, despite the chill in the air. A faint rush touched her cheekbones again, quick and unwanted. She broke contact almost immediately, turning to pace a short circle around him as if testing how he looked from the outside. "Not terrible," she said, "for someone who spent last night trying to bleed out on me." "That's high praise," he said. "Don't get used to it." He smiled, small and real this time. It faded as a tremor ran through his leg, warning that whatever fragile strength he had scraped together was burning out. Lyra saw it before he spoke. "Enough," she said. "Sit before you fall. I need you tired, not broken." He didn't argue. That, he decided, could be another lesson for later. He eased himself down onto one of the lower chunks of wall, using his hands more than his knees. The rock was cold through the worn fabric of his trousers. He let his shoulders slump, just a little, as the strain of standing bled out of him in waves. Lyra watched his chest rise and fall, counting breaths the way she might count steps between traps. When she was satisfied he wasn't about to tip over or vomit, she turned away, scanning the hall beyond their little island again. The mist in the left-hand corridor had thickened while they worked, pooling low and blue at the floor. Echo felt a faint, sour tug in his palm when his eyes drifted that way, like a warning he couldn't yet translate. He rubbed his thumb over the spiral, feeling the ridges under his skin. "What does it want?" he asked, mostly to himself. "The veil?" Lyra said, not looking back. "Or the mark?" "Both," he said. "Everything," she answered, "usually." He let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it had more room. "I'm not giving it everything," he said. Her head tilted. For a moment he thought she might turn, might let him see what that answer did to her expression. Instead, she stepped toward the open hall, testing the ground with the tip of her boot. "Good," she said. "We're going to need something left when it comes to collect."
Echo watched her test the ground, then the dark. "How long can we stay here?" he asked. "Longer than the veil likes," Lira said. "Less than we'd like. It will start changing its mind about this place soon." "It has a lot of minds," he said. "Too many." She glanced over her shoulder at him. "Which is why we move before it notices we're comfortable." He almost pointed out that nothing about any of this felt like comfort. Then he realized that, for her, a day without something trying to bite her in half probably counted. "How far?" he asked instead. "Far enough to find air that hasn't already learned our scent," she said. "Not far enough to make your stitches jealous of your skin." He nodded. The motion felt steadier than before. The idea of walking made his wounds flare in anticipation, but another thought burned just as bright. The memory of how helpless he had been when the monster filled the tunnel, when Lyra's voice had been the only thing between him and the dark. "Out there, you'll keep showing me?" She huffed. "You think I'm going to drag you through the veil and not fix your pathetic stance every time you try to die with it?" She jerked her head toward the hall. "Come on, if you fall, at least aim for somewhere soft, like your pride." He pushed himself up from the broken wall, slower this time, using legs and core the way she had just forced him to feel. The pain came in waves instead of a single crushing tide. He could work with waves. Step by step, they left the small triangle of stone behind. Each placement of his foot was a decision now, not an accident. He tested patches of floor with the edge of his boot before trusting his weight. He listened for the faint crunch that meant loose debris, for the subtle hollow that hinted at a space beneath. Lira watched from the corner of her eye, pretending to focus only on the shadows ahead. Once, when he misjudged and his foot slid, her hand shot out on instinct, fingers catching his elbow before he could pitch forward. Her grip lingered a fraction too long. Heat flicked across her face again, invisible under the smudges of dirt and the careful set of her mouth. "Smaller steps," she said, letting go. "You're not racing the mist." "I thought everything here is," he said. "Everything that's dying," she answered. "We're trying not to join the chorus yet." The corridor narrowed, then opened into a wider chamber where the ceiling had partially collapsed. A ragged hole above let in a wash of thicker light, the color of old bone. Broken beams jutted from the pile of rubble like snapped ribs. Puddles of stagnant water caught the glow and turned it into dull plates on the floor. Lira lifted a hand, signaling for him to stop. "Listen," she said. He obeyed. At first all he heard was his own breathing, too loud in his ears. Then under it, the slow drip of water, the distant rumble of something heavy shifting far away, the nearly inaudible scratch of tiny claws in the walls. Small things, not interested in prey as big as they were yet. "And smell," she added.
He drew air in carefully through his nose. Stone. Mold. Old ash. The metallic ghost of older blood. Underneath it, faint but growing, a sour, rotting note that didn't belong to the damp walls or his own bandages. "Something dead," he said. "Good." Her eyes scanned the edges of the room. "Closer than I'd like. Not long enough for the veil to eat the story." He frowned. "Story?" "Bodies tell them," she said. "If you look before everything forgets." She started forward again, angling toward the right-hand side of the chamber where the light didn't reach as easily. Echo followed, careful to place his feet where hers had just been. It wasn't trust so much as borrowed experience. The smell strengthened with each step. It wasn't the sweet rot of something that had been left to lie for seasons or the fresh, hot copper of a recent kill. It sat somewhere in between. Flesh that had started to sink into itself, fluids dried at the edges and still damp in the deep places. They rounded a shattered pillar, and there he was. The corpse sat half-slumped against a section of fallen wall, as if he had tried to stand one last time and failed. One leg was twisted under him at a wrong angle, the other stuck out, boots scuffed and split. His head lolled to one side, jaw slack, eyes long since given over to whatever the veil used to replace insects. His clothes had once been sturdy, layers of leather and fabric thicker than Echo's, reinforced at the forearms and shoulders. Time and whatever had torn into him had reduced them to ragged panels. The chest was caved in on one side, ribs collapsed inward under something that hit hard and fast. Blackened strains spread from the wound, seeping into cloth and stone, but they had long since dried to a brittle crust.
Echo stopped without meaning to. His own chest tightened in sympathy, ghosts of pain rippling through his own half-healed injuries. Lira approached with a slow, deliberate caution. Not reverence, not quite. More like the wary respect of one hunter seeing another who had reached the end of a trail. She crouched a safe arm's length away, eyes scanning for movement first. No flies, no drip of fresh blood, no hitch in the corpse's chest. Satisfied, she eased closer, careful not to disturb the pattern of dust and old droplets on the ground. Echo's palm burned. It was sudden and sharp, a lance of cold that stabbed up through his hand and into his forearm. He hissed, fingers curling as if he had grabbed a handful of ice. Lyra's head snapped up. "What?" she demanded. He held up his hand. The spiral etched into his skin had darkened, lines standing out against his palm as if inked anew. No light, no glow, just an intensity that hadn't been there a breath before. "It feels it," Echo said through clenched teeth, "like at the circle, like the mirror, but different." Lyra's gaze followed the line of his arm to his hand, then back to the corpse. Her eyes narrowed. "Stay there," she said. He didn't argue. The mark's cold was seeping into his knuckles now, a slow, unwelcome tide. He flexed his fingers, trying to keep them from going numb. Lira shifted sideways, bringing herself parallel to the dead man, rather than directly in front. From this angle, the pattern of his fall became clearer. Scratches scored the stone near his boots, as if he had tried to drag himself away from whatever had struck him. One hand still reached toward the open space of the chamber, fingers frozen in a clawing grasp at nothing. Next broken, chest crushed from the side, not straight on. No teeth marks, no tearing. Her gaze traced invisible lines in the air, mapping the arc of a blow. Something big, heavy, fast, hit once and didn't bother hitting twice. "Monster?" Echo asked. "Or stone," she said. "Or the veil moving its own bones. Hard to tell. But this..." She leaned in a fraction, squinting at the dead man's skin where the torn collar of his shirt had slipped aside. There, just above the line of his heart, a spiral had been carved. It wasn't identical to Echo's.
His mark was a single, unbroken line twisting inward, tight and precise. This one branched. Lines split off from the main curve like crooked rivers, looping back in smaller circles before rejoining. The grooves were deeper, too, as if whoever or whatever had made them hadn't been concerned about how much pain it caused. Lira didn't touch it. Her fingers hovered a finger breadth away, tracing the shape through the air. "See it?" she asked. Echo swallowed. "Yes," he said. His palm burned hotter. For a heartbeat, the outer edges of his own spiral darkened in response, an echo of the other man's fractured design. A sharp ache stabbed behind his eyes, like the beginning of one of the veil's visions, but no images came, just the weight of being recognized by something that was no longer alive. "He was marked," Echo whispered. "Looks that way," Lira said softly. She sat back on her heels, studying the corpse anew. Details arranged themselves in her mind with each careful glance. The worn places on the man's boots that spoke of long walks over rough ground, the calluses on his fingers in different patterns than Echo's, as if he had spent more time pulling rope than holding a knife, the extra straps on his belt where gear had once hung and now lay scattered or gone. Not from a day ago, not from a year, a month, maybe 2, long enough for the veil to stop paying attention, not long enough for it to forget. Echo's throat felt dry again. "Do you think he knew what he was before this?" he asked. Lyra's lips pressed into a thin line. "Does it matter now?" she said. Then after a beat, quieter, "He fought. You can see it there." She nodded toward the gouges in the stone. "He tried to get away. Whatever got him didn't bother to finish the meal." Echo's gaze drifted to the dead man's hand. The fingers had frozen mid-reach, knuckles white under skin turned a grayish hue. Had he been reaching for help? For a weapon? For something only he could see? The cold in Echo's palm settled into a throb. Not a demand, not yet. Just a presence, insistent and aware. The veil keeps those who keep themselves. The thought rose from somewhere deep, tangled up in the first words he had heard when he woke in this world. Back then, they had sounded like a sentence handed down. Now, staring at the man who had not been kept, they felt more like a question. Lira rose slowly, joints protesting with small snaps and pops. She took a single step back, then another, widening the space between herself and the corpse without turning her back on it. "Don't touch him. Not the clothes, not the mark, not anything he dropped. Whatever agreement he had with the veil ended when his neck did. We don't know what it thinks of thieves." He nodded. He didn't realize he had been leaning forward until he eased himself upright again, fighting a weird pull toward the dead man's gear, the ghost of a scavenger's instinct sharpened by hunger and need. Someone could have, he searched for the word, helped him. No one was here, or if they were, they chose not to be when it counted. He glanced at her. She met his gaze without flinching. "You're wondering if I would have walked past you like that." He said nothing. He didn't have to. "I didn't," she added. "I know. Don't make me regret it," she said. But there was no bite in the words. They stood there a while longer in the stale light, 3 bodies in a room, one breathing a little too fast, and one that would never breathe again. The veil's mist curled at the edges of the chamber, as if it were trying to decide whether to reclaim what was left. Echo swallowed. "The mark. On him. On me. Do you think it's the same hand that put them there?" Lyra's eyes flicked to his palm, then back to the twisted spiral over the dead man's heart.
I think the veil likes patterns, and it likes to change them. That's not an answer, he said. It's the only one I have, she replied. He looked at the corpse one last time. The face meant nothing to him. The clothes, the tools, the shape of the body, they all blurred into the kind of anonymous human form the veil had been using to populate his nightmares since the first day. Except this one had a spiral. This one had been chosen, marked, and then left like any other piece of rubble. Something quiet and cold settled in Echo's chest beside the fear and the pain and the stubbornness that had dragged him into this conversation in the first place. If there was one, he said slowly, then there were more. Lira didn't answer at once. She turned her head, scanning the chamber, the corridors, the roof with its cracked opening. Her gaze lingered on the scratches on the floor, the angle of the collapsed stones, the way the dust had settled over old blood. There were other marks, too, lower on the wall, almost lost under a film of mold. Half-faded spirals, smaller and less precise, as if someone had dragged their fingers there while being pulled away. Her fingers flexed at her sides, remembering the burn of her own unseen mark, the way the mirror had shown her things she hadn't asked to see. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its usual rough humor. It was stripped down to bone. "We're not the first," Lira said. The words hung in the stale air between them, heavier than any stone in the room. Echo's hand closed into a fist around the spiral in his palm. It dug into his skin, sharp and real. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The dead man didn't move either, but the story of the room had shifted, tilted just enough to show an edge neither of them had seen before. Not the first, which meant there had been others, which meant there might still be more.